Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Robinson Run. I'm your host, Brady Crytzer. Spring is here in western Pennsylvania. It's a little windy here, so bear with me. And it's been a long winter. For me, it's been a winter of research, digging through archives, online resources, warranty maps, you name it. But now the weather's in the 60s. You can see beautiful Robinson Run right behind me here, and it's going to be a time for us to really, in the second half of our Robinson Run series here, episode 12, really expand out on a lot of the details that we've been going over so far. We've talked, of course, about James Ewing, Gabriel Walker, and Isaac Walker, and we've talked about the many sort of trials and tribulations and really incredible American Revolutionary and early frontier settlement history of this region. Now I want to take this a little further out and expand about who else is living in Robinson Run, because I think I may have misled you into believing that those two families were the only ones, and of course that's not going to be the case. Now we can't talk about everybody who lived here in what was formerly Washington County and then later Allegheny County in the 18th century, but we will talk about the people that leave tangible marks behind that we can see. And one of them is the cabin that's right over my shoulder. Right here along State Route 978, Oakdale Road, just outside of Oakdale, Pennsylvania, sits a log cabin, and it is a log cabin from the 1790s. It's one of the great preserved log cabins we have in all of western Pennsylvania. And the curious thing about this cabin is that even though it's 230 years old, it's actually not sitting anywhere near its original location. This cabin is here and it's preserved because a lot of people cared very deeply about it and saved it from an otherwise pretty perilous situation. This cabin is today known as Kilbuck Lodge, and it is controlled by a wonderful group of civic-minded individuals called the Friends of Kilbuck Lodge. This is the home base of Boy Scouts of America Troop 248. This is my son's Boy Scout group, in interest of full disclosure. But it's a wonderful opportunity for the boys and the girls involved in the organization because they get to deal so closely with such a rare and precious resource. So let's talk a little bit about this cabin. Kilbuck Lodge originally sat about a mile away from where we are today, off of Robinson Run, on a farm that was called the Robb Farm. But it wasn't the Robb Farm in the time of Gabriel and Isaac Walker in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution. Back then, that property was owned by a man named Thomas Hanna, and I'll put the image on the screen for you to take a look at. Thomas Hanna's like a lot of these early settlers, like Ewing, like the Walker brothers, like a lot of the people that lived here, in that they were early Scots-Irish settlers, and they came from eastern Pennsylvania. You'll remember that Gabriel Walker and Isaac Walker were part of a pre-existing community in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And what tied them together was they were all part of the ministry of probably the most famous Presbyterian minister in America of the 18th century, the Reverend John Cuthbertson. If you haven't seen episodes 1 and 2 of Robinson Run, I went to the Reverend John Cuthbertson's church and his burial site. Please go check that out. Because remember, it's Cuthbertson's movement through this area that's going to bring so many of these early settlers, like the Walkers, like the Scots, like the Ewings, and yes, like the Hannas, that are going to be responsible for, again, why they're here. Thomas Hanna, who owned the original site of this cabin, and very likely the builder, was a member of Cuthbertson's flock. We actually have the record of baptism for Thomas Hanna. Now, this was in 1785, and it was done by the Reverend John Cuthbertson, but that would have probably meant that Thomas Hanna was the son of the builder of this cabin. But this cabin sat off of what was called Robb Hill Road here in North Fayette Township. The Robb Farm today, still a working farm. And this cabin, even though it was from the 18th century, was deteriorating. It was falling apart, but it was well made. My gosh, was it well made. because it was collapsing, was caving in, but the bones of it, which is the outer structure of this type of log cabin, was in great condition. So in the 1930s, all the way through 1935, so about 30 to 35, the family that owned the Robb farm donated this cabin to the Boy Scouts of America. And according to local lore, they loaded onto horse-drawn wagons and they disassembled the cabin like giant Lincoln logs, piece by piece, and they brought it to this location and they constructed it. And this is where it's sat ever since, almost for 100 years. This cabin has been kind of the heart historically of Oakdale and one of the real kind of connections to our 18th century past here in this region. Along with being the home of the Boy Scouts of America, again, Pack 248, it's held dances, fundraisers. It's been like a community center of sorts for Oakdale for, again, most of the last century. So it's a very cool tie to the 1700s. Now, a couple things about this, and we'll go a little closer and look at some close-up shots of the cabin. Again, it's not in the original location that it used to be. It's from about a mile away, maybe a little less. But frontier settlers built cabins like this for very specific reasons. Number one, the material is abundant. It's just made from felled trees. And number two, it worked really well. Now, even though the Hanna family that built this cabin were Scots-Irish, like Gabriel Walker, Isaac Walker, James Ewing, Scots-Irish, this type of cabin was not a Scots-Irish cabin. They never built this in Scotland or Ireland or anywhere in the British Isles. Believe it or not, this style of cabin was perfected in Scandinavia. It was perfected in Sweden. And when the early Swedish settlers came to Pennsylvania in the 1670s and 1680s, back east in and around Philadelphia and Delaware, these are the kind of cabins they built. Because Scandinavia, much more than the British Isles, is perilously cold, incredibly cold. And those early Swedish settlers knew one thing, and it was how to stay warm. Native Americans did not build cabins like this. The English did not build cabins like this. The Scots-Irish did not build cabins like this. This is really important to understand. This is kind of a unique product of the American frontier. Because remember, the American frontier is a place of blending. It's a place where cultures come together. So the Scots-Irish who moved here saw the effectiveness of the Swedish cabin, and they said, we're going to replicate that. So even though this cabin, what's called Kilbuck Lodge, named after a Lenni Lenape chief, Killbuck, who lived in the region, had nothing to do with this though. Even though it's named after a Native American and was built by a Scots-Irish family, it's a Swedish design, which I think is so important because you'd see cabins like this everywhere. So let's go head up to Kilbuck Lodge, take a closer look, and get a better sense of this. Right now I'm standing on the outside of Kilbuck Lodge. And this is a classic, as I zoom out, frontier cabin in the Swedish style. And if you've ever built with Lincoln logs as a kid, you know exactly what this looks like. The way these log cabins worked is you would fell a tree and you shape it into a square pattern. You would stack them on top of each other. Let's go take a look. In this sort of Lincoln log style stacking, this sort of dovetail style. You can see the corner of the cabin here. What's incredible about this cabin, even though it was moved, is that these are the original felled trees from Thomas Hanna's original plantation about a mile away. I'm literally touching the craftsmanship and the handiwork of the 18th century. Now, as these stack, you can see there's always going to be a gap in between the logs. You can't, even if you're the finest builder of the 18th century, get things that precise. So the way that the people inside would insulate their homes, keep them warm, is by creating what we call a chinking and daubing system. So they would first fill these gaps with really whatever they could, usually substantial pieces of wood, bark, little bits of stone, moss, whatever, to fill in the gaps in between the logs. And then they create daubing, which goes on the outside. Daubing is usually a mixture of sand, clay, sometimes local lime, whatever they have. And it would, once wet, harden up and become almost like a concrete. Now that doesn't sound glamorous, and it's not. But what's really neat about this is it's actually a wonderful insulator. And this is why the Swedish style was adopted by so many people on the 18th century frontier. Tom Taylor, who is really the heart and soul historically of this community, always likes to say, if you want to stay warm in this cabin, start a fire at the beginning of the day, come back at the end of the night, and if you're lucky, it'll reach 60 degrees. Tom Taylor's spent more time in this cabin than anyone else. In fact, his ancestors were some of the ones that actually put this together. But this is like an incredible testament to preservation and need and desire to keep the 18th century alive. Now, if you go to places like Boston, Philadelphia, Williamsburg, Winchester, Virginia, you're going to see a lot of really old houses. And they're old and they're still there because people have constantly lived in them. People have taken care of them and maintained them. These old Swedish style log cabins were never ever meant to last this long. I think if you go to the Hanna farm and you saw Thomas Hanna from the 1780s and you showed him that his logs and his cabins were still here, he wouldn't believe it. These were temporary homes for the most part, maybe meant to last 20 to 30 years, but never more than that. They never believed what they were building would ever be preserved well into the 21st century. But they are, because people care, and that's what matters. These log cabins used to be all over western Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, but they're mostly all gone because they're made of natural materials and they deteriorate. So why is this cabin still here? Well, in about 2015, the Friends of Kilbuck Lodge were raising money to preserve the cabin because, again, time catches up with everybody. And a television series actually stepped up to finish the job and rebuild the cabin. I have some images of it here. But one of the things that they did to keep it safe, to make sure it survives, and I'll back up so you can see it, is add a foundation base and a modern foundation base. And we can forgive them for that because it means that Kilbuck Lodge, even though they wouldn't have built it this way in the 1780s, will survive for us to use in the modern day. So it's a great example of historic craftsmanship blended with modern technology, and it's really the only way a cabin like this can survive. So let's take a moment and appreciate the workmanship that we see here. So we're back. Kilbuck Lodge is a wonderful connection to the 18th century. I do want to stress this is private property. This is home of the Boy Scouts of America, owned by the Friends of Kilbuck Lodge. This is great because it's a cabin you can see from the road. So if you're traveling into Oakdale on State Route 978, slow down, take a gander. Please respect private property boundaries. This is not a public history site, but very visible from the road. And because of these organizations, preserved for us forever. All right, everybody, it's springtime. It's Robinson Run. We're back. We'll see you next time.